September 22nd, 1943. 0700 hours. Kaafjord, northern Norway. Lieutenant Duncan Cameron wiped condensation from the cracked periscope lens and pressed his eye to the glass. The image swam in and out of focus. Grey water, grey cliffs, a faint shimmer of steel somewhere ahead. The control room was silent except for the low hum of the trim pumps and the creak of strained metal. The air smelled of oil and battery acid. 40 feet below the surface, the 4 men of X6 had been sealed inside their 51-foot midget submarine for more than 35 hours. "Periscope clear," Cameron murmured. His voice was flat, the tone of habit, not calm. The others waited for his next order. They were deep inside enemy waters, moving through the final bends of Kaafjord, the most heavily defended anchorage in all of occupied Europe. Above them, artillery batteries stood on the ridges, and around them, layers of anti-torpedo nets sagged in the cold green water. Somewhere ahead, beyond the haze, lay their target, the German battleship Tirpitz, 42,000 tons of armor and gun steel, the largest warship afloat. Cameron checked his watch. 0710. He knew the other X-craft, X5 and X7, were somewhere in the fjord, though whether they had made it through was uncertain. The plan had been simple in theory. Slip through the nets, plant 2 crescent-shaped explosive charges beneath Tirpitz, and escape before the fuses burned down. The execution was anything but simple. Their gyro compass had failed the previous night. The automatic helm was broken. The starboard charge was leaking seawater. "We'll finish it by guess and by God," Cameron had told his men. None had argued. At periscope depth again, he caught a glimpse of light rippling across the hull of a moored destroyer, no more than 100 yards off. The fjord was a maze of ships, tankers, patrol boats, net tenders, each one a sentry. He eased the controls forward, feeling the drag of the flooded starboard side. The motor whined, and the boat trembled. For a moment, he thought the sound would carry through the water and give them away. Then it passed. On the surface, morning was breaking, a pale Arctic light stretching over the mountains, the kind of stillness that made every small sound carry for miles. From the bridge of Tirpitz, German lookouts scanned the fjord through binoculars, unaware of what was moving toward them in the dark water below. 18 months of design and training had led to this single morning. The X-craft had been built for one purpose only, to strike targets that ordinary submarines could not reach. Each boat carried 2 detachable mines, 2 tons of Amatex apiece, mounted like saddle tanks along the hull. Detonated beneath the keel of a battleship, they would lift it from the water. The men inside X6 had spent the night hiding among the Bratholm Islands, recharging batteries and checking fuses. Now, cramped and running short of air, they were closing on the final barrier. Cameron knew the nets ahead were supposed to stop anything larger than a seal from getting through. The intelligence brief had claimed they were 60 feet deep. He doubted that now. He gave a final order. "Stand by to surface." The ballast vents hissed. The submarine rose slowly, water sheeting off the hull as it broke into the chill morning air. Through the periscope, a grey wall loomed, the outer gate of Tirpitz's enclosure, and beyond it, the faint outline of the battleship herself. Cameron exhaled once, low and controlled. "We go now," he said. He edged the craft forward in the wake of a passing trawler, steering directly into the gate as it closed behind. For several seconds there was nothing. No alarm, no shout from above. Only the faint churn of the trawler's propellers fading into distance. What Cameron didn't know was that his entry had gone unseen, that within the hour, 2 British submarines would be lying beneath the most powerful warship in the world, and that the calm, grey water above them was about to erupt. The gate shut behind them with a dull metallic groan. Inside the fjord, X6 crept forward at 2 knots, trim pumps pulsing like a heartbeat. The rock walls rose sheer on both sides, grey in the dim Arctic light. Above, destroyers and net tenders swung at anchor. Every hammer blow and anchor chain echoed through the hull. Cameron stood bent over the periscope, wiping the lens dry again and again. The image blurred with seawater. A tanker's silhouette, the reflection of a mountain ridge, ripples against a buoy. The air was thick with oil and heat. Condensation dripped onto the chart table. "Keep her steady," he said. No one spoke after that. 2 miles astern, Lieutenant Godfrey Place in X7 was following the same route. He had already torn free of the outer nets once, losing part of his compass mount. 2 of the original 6X craft were gone. X8 scuttled after an explosion. X9 lost with all hands. If either X-6 or X-7 failed now, the entire operation would collapse. By 0630, the temperature inside X6 had climbed past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The men stripped to undershirts, hands black with grease. The air was thin and metallic. Petty Officer Whittam watched the gauge needles shake as the submarine listed slightly to starboard. "Feels like we're cooking in here," he muttered. Ahead lay the final obstacle, the inner anti-submarine net around Tirpitz. Intelligence had claimed it hung 60 feet deep. When they reached it, the mesh stretched to the seabed. 3 attempts failed to find a gap. Each time they rose, the hull scraped wire. "No bottom clearance," Cameron said quietly. He knew the attack window was closing. Then he saw movement through the mist, a small picket launch entering the boom gate. The water boiled faintly in its wake. Cameron made his decision without consulting the crew. Surface. Full buoyancy. X-6 broke through the surface behind the launch, sliding through the gate as it closed. The casing struck metal, but no alarm sounded. Inside the enclosure, Tirpitz filled the viewfinder. Her hull stretched nearly 800 feet, grey and still against the cliffs. Cameron ordered a dive. At 0700, the periscope motor burned out. Smoke filled the control room. The crew coughed and wiped their faces, eyes streaming. Cameron pressed on blind, steering by dead reckoning. Minutes later, the bow struck a submerged rock, forcing X6 to the surface, 80 yards abeam of Tirpitz. German lookouts shouted. Small arms fire rattled off the hull. Cameron dived again, leveling the craft beneath the shadow of the battleship. He released both mines under B turret and set the timers. At 0720, X7 reached position astern, placing its own charges beneath the bridge and aft turrets. Both crews were now inside the blast zone. Cameron scuttled X6 and surfaced to surrender. A German launch pulled alongside. Captain Hans Meyer had the prisoners brought aboard, and, after a long look, ordered coffee and schnapps. It was 0810. Below them, 8 tons of Amatex were counting down. 0812 hours. The calm surface of Kaafjord lifted like a lung. A blast deep beneath the waterline struck the Tirpitz with such force that her stern rose 6 feet clear of the fjord. Bulkheads snapped, lights failed, and steel groaned across the ship's 800-foot length. Men were hurled from ladders. In the engine room, gauges shattered in sequence as the deck pitched underfoot. One German sailor who had served aboard Scharnhorst shouted later, "We've had torpedo hits, we've had bomb hits, but there's never been an explosion like that." For several seconds, no one on board understood what had happened. Then orders collided. Watertight doors slammed. Damage control teams ran for the stern compartments. Officers shouted conflicting commands from the bridge. Electrical fires broke out near the port turbine room. Ammunition hoists jammed. The ship's emergency generators failed, plunging half the vessel into darkness. Above deck, smoke and spray drifted across the mountain slopes. Captain Hans Meyer took command from the bridge, demanding reports from every section. The first messages were confused. Flooding aft, shafts out of alignment, hull distorted near the stern. He ordered divers over the side to inspect for torpedo damage, still refusing to believe a submarine could have penetrated the nets. No vessel of that size can have come through, he told his first officer. Yet the shock had twisted Tirpitz's rudder stock and immobilized all 3 propeller shafts. Within minutes, she was dead in the water. On the deck near the forward turrets stood 4 captured men from X6. German sailors surrounded them, pointing, jeering. The British officer, Lieutenant Cameron, watched the confusion spreading along the ship. He noticed a diver being lowered overside. They don't know it's under them, he thought. When a petty officer demanded to know how many submarines there were, the prisoners stayed silent. A pistol appeared. Before the situation could escalate, Admiral Oskar Kummetz arrived aboard from the shore command and ordered the weapon lowered. "We will question them later," he said. Below the surface, X7 had survived the initial shockwave. Lieutenant Place found his boat wrenched free of the nets, but badly damaged. Control rods jammed, dials broken. He tried to rise to periscope depth, but the boat breached wildly, drawing gunfire from Tirpitz and nearby flak ships. Shells ripped through the casing. Place decided to abandon. He surfaced again near a moored gunnery target, waved a white sweater, and climbed into the freezing water. His submarine began to sink bow first. 3 crew trapped inside. 1 escaped. 2 drowned. At 0830, the fjord fell silent again, except for the hiss of escaping steam. Then the long echo of the blast rolled back from the cliffs. 500 tons of seawater had flooded into Tirpitz's hull. 4 of her massive 15-inch turrets were thrown from their roller mountings. Internal frames near the engine room buckled. Though her watertight integrity held, the ship's structural spine was distorted beyond repair. The Germans had survived the explosion, but Tirpitz was finished as a fighting unit. Admiral Kummetz signaled Berlin that the battleship would be out of action for at least 6 months. Churchill, reading the decrypted report in London days later, wrote 1 line in the margin: "At last." The men who had crippled the Tirpitz were already prisoners at Mar-Lago, near Bremen, alive but convinced they had failed. They would not know for weeks that their attack had accomplished what 2 years of bombing raids could not. When the noise finally died in Kaafjord, the full extent of the damage began to surface. Divers working along Tirpitz's port quarter reported rents in the hull, plating large enough to pass a man through. The rudder stocks were twisted, and the propeller shafts no longer aligned with their housings. Inside the ship, engineers found the stern compartments distorted by the upward heave of the blast. The shock had thrown turbines off their foundations and cracked auxiliary steam lines. 3 engines were disabled beyond immediate repair. In Berlin, the naval staff logged the incident as a mine explosion of unknown origin. Hitler demanded an inquiry and ordered that Tirpitz remain in Norwegian waters under maximum defense conditions. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the Kriegsmarine, requested a technical report. It concluded that the ship would be inoperative for no fewer than 6 months. The German Naval Construction Office sent specialist engineers north from Kiel with emergency teams and steel reinforcement frames. For the crew of Tirpitz, the aftermath resembled a slow-motion shipwreck. The vessel remained afloat, but dead, her stern sunk deeper in the water than her bow. Pumps ran constantly to keep the flooding contained. Workshops were set up on the fjord's edge to cut replacement beams. In freezing weather, divers worked by lamplight, welding below the waterline in 6-hour shifts. Some slept in engine rooms where the air stank of burnt insulation. It was like repairing a ship underwater, one sailor later wrote. In London, British intelligence began intercepting traffic, confirming the success of Operation Source. Norwegian agents in Alta reported visible deformation along the ship's stern and reduced radio activity from the Kaafjord station. On September 25th, Bletchley Park decoded a signal from Admiral Cummets, reporting that Tirpitz's power and steering were lost. Winston Churchill annotated the cable, "The beast is crippled." Well done, the midgets. While repairs continued through the Arctic winter, Tirpitz remained stationary, her guns pointed toward the sea she could no longer patrol. For the Royal Navy, this single outcome shifted the balance in the North Atlantic. Convoy PQ-24 reached the Soviet ports without interference. Dozens of merchant ships, once diverted around Iceland, resumed direct routes through the Barents Sea. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser wrote that, "For the first time in 2 years, the northern convoys move without the shadow of the battleship." Back in Germany, propaganda minimized the blow. Official communiques described the incident as temporary mechanical failure due to underwater concussion. Privately, Dönitz ordered an inquiry into the effectiveness of the fjord's defenses and concluded that midget submarines were now a permanent threat to heavy units at anchor. The Kriegsmarine expanded anti-submarine net systems around Scharnhorst, Lützow, and all major Norwegian bases. By April 1944, 7 months after the attack, Tirpitz was still under repair. Her hull had been strengthened, but engine tests revealed chronic vibration and misalignment. She could steam only 10 knots before flooding resumed. In May, she was declared unfit for Atlantic operations and confined to Norwegian waters for the remainder of the war. The attack by X-6 and X-7, executed in less than 3 hours, had achieved what hundreds of bombers had failed to do in 2 years: remove the German Navy's most powerful ship from the war's front line. The fjord that had once been her fortress had become her cage. By the time winter closed over northern Norway, Tirpitz had become a ship under siege by her own surroundings. Repair barges froze into the fjord, and the mountain ridges that had once sheltered her now trapped the exhaust of diesel heaters, pumping warm air into the damaged hull. Divers from the Marinewerft Kiel worked day and night under floodlights, strung from the cranes. They replaced 500 tons of distorted plating and realigned the port shafts using massive hydraulic jacks. By January 1944, the hull was watertight, but none of the engines could operate beyond idle. Each test revealed new fractures in the turbine housings. To conceal her immobility, the Germans constructed dummy wakes on the fjord, releasing oil slicks and wave machines to imitate a moving battleship. Radio operators broadcast decoy transmissions, suggesting Tirpitz was patrolling off the Lofoten Islands. Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons staged mock reports of her departures, hoping to confuse Allied intelligence. But the deception failed. Norwegian agents in Alta and RAF photographic units based in Scotland continued to send images showing the ship unmoved in Kaafjord. In February 1944, the Royal Air Force shifted focus from submarine operations to direct bombing. The first raid, Operation Tungsten, was planned in conjunction with the Fleet Air Arm. Dozens of Fairey Barracuda dive bombers took off from carriers Victorious and Furious in the early morning of April 3rd. They struck Kaafjord in 2 waves, scoring 15 hits. Bombs tore through the upper decks, killing 122 men and wounding over 300. The ship's bridge was wrecked, radar destroyed, and the forward turrets immobilized again. For the crew, survival became mechanical. Fire parties worked in knee-deep water to contain burning fuel lines. The smell of cordite and hot metal clung to the air for days. "We fought the ship like a building on fire," one sailor wrote later. There was nowhere to run, only decks to climb. Captain Hans Meyer was seriously injured and replaced soon after. In response, the German High Command ordered even more anti-aircraft batteries, over 150 guns, installed around Kaafjord and the adjacent slopes. Camouflage nets were expanded to cover an area of nearly 10 acres. Yet the repeated repairs had weakened the structure further. By summer, internal stress testing showed that Tirpitz could no longer sustain gunnery operations without risk of hull failure. When the Luftwaffe's 5th Air Fleet reported shortages of fighter cover in northern Norway, Dönitz transferred Tirpitz to Tromsø Fjord in October 1944, believing the new position would improve defense coordination. The move took 3 weeks, conducted entirely at night under escort from destroyers Zid-29 and Zid-30. On November 12, 1944, the RAF's 9 and 617 squadrons struck from bases in Scotland under Operation Catechism. 32 Avro Lancasters carried the new 13,000-pound tall-boy bombs. One penetrated Tirpitz's deck near Turret Caesar, detonating the magazine. The blast flipped the ship upside down in minutes. 950 men died. Only about 80 survived. The once feared flagship of the Kriegsmarine now lay broken in Tromsø Fjord. For Germany, the loss ended any hope of a surface fleet presence in the north. For Britain, the destruction marked the closure of a campaign that had begun 2 years earlier in silence beneath the fjord. When the war ended, Tirpitz lay capsized in Tromsø Fjord, her keel jutting from the water like the frame of a wrecked bridge. Norwegian work crews built rafts over the overturned hull, cutting steel plates with oxyacetylene torches that hissed day and night. The British Admiralty declared the ship beyond salvage, but the Norwegian government claimed ownership of the remains under maritime law. In 1948, contracts were signed with the salvage firm Høvding Skipsophugging, beginning a dismantling process that would last nearly a decade. The early work was slow. Divers had to clear unexploded ordnance and hundreds of shells trapped inside the inverted turrets. Many compartments were still sealed, containing the bodies of crewmen killed during the explosion. By 1950, over 950 sets of remains had been recorded. Local villagers recalled the smell of diesel and rust drifting for miles down the fjord as cutting torches opened new chambers. Each section was winched to the surface and towed to the smelting yards at Hamarøy. The scrap value proved significant. Norwegian authorities estimated that 50,000 tons of steel and non-ferrous metal were recovered from the wreck between 1948 and 1957, fueling the post-war construction boom. Pieces of Tirpitz's armor were repurposed into bridges, ship plates, and industrial machinery. Her thickest deck segments, up to 12 inches of Krupp cemented steel, had to be blown apart with small demolition charges. Workers recorded temperatures inside the inverted hull, reaching over 120 degrees Fahrenheit during summer cutting operations. For Germany, the destruction of Tirpitz closed a chapter that had begun with promise and ended in isolation. She had been commissioned in February 1941 as the pride of the Kriegsmarine's planned Zed program, intended to project naval power across the North Atlantic. 4 years later, she was a memory, erased not by a decisive battle, but by a cumulative campaign: midget submarines, carrier strikes, and precision bombing. Her loss left the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau without capital ship support, effectively ending the surface threat to Allied convoys in northern waters. In Britain, the legacy of Operation Source endured within the submarine service. The surviving ex-craft veterans returned from captivity in 1945 and were quietly decorated. Lieutenant Duncan Cameron and Lieutenant Godfrey Place received the Victoria Cross. Place remained in the Royal Navy, rising to Rear Admiral before retiring in 1971. Cameron continued in command postings until his death on active duty in 1961. Both men spoke little about Kaafjord. "It was work that had to be done," Place told an interviewer decades later. By the 1960s, the fjords that had hidden Tirpitz were open to tourists. Only fragments of steel remained, scattered along the seabed. Divers still recover small relics, rivets, tools, a fragment of deck railing stamped KM 1941. The water is clear and silent now, the outlines of the wreck softened by algae and silt. The battleship that once held the North Atlantic in check ended as raw material for the reconstruction of the country she once occupied. The war's largest symbol of naval dominance became, in peacetime, the scaffolding of a rebuilt Norway. In the official British histories published after 1945, Operation Source was presented as a complete and self-contained success. 6 X-craft dispatched, 2 boats, X6 and X7, confirmed to have placed their charges, Tirpitz crippled. But in the margins of the naval intelligence files, one entry never closed cleanly: the loss of X5, commanded by 21-year-old Lieutenant H. Henty Creer, Royal Navy. German reports from Kaafjord recorded a small submarine sighted at 0843 hours on the 22nd of September, 1943, moving inside the anchorage after the main explosions. The battleship's guns and nearby batteries opened fire. The craft was claimed destroyed with all hands. No British crewman from X5 was ever recovered. From this point, 2 versions ran in parallel. The Admiralty's operational debrief, based on signals from Norway and interrogations of captured German officers, concluded that X5 had missed the agreed 0500 to 0800 drop window, remained in the fjord, and was destroyed while attempting to withdraw. But among officers who had trained with Henty Creer at Loch Cairnborn, and in his family's papers, circulated another view, that X5 had in fact laid her charges first, before X6 and X7, and that the excessive lift under Tirpitz's stern at 0812 could only be explained by more than 4 tons of explosive. Rear Admiral C.B. Barry's later description of the raid as one of the most courageous acts of all time was frequently cited by those arguing that the missing boat should have been honoured alongside Cameron and Place. The technical case was simple. Each X-craft carried 2 2-ton Amatex charges. X6 planted under B turret. X7 reported placing 1 forward, 1 aft. German divers later noted extensive seabed disturbance behind the ship, consistent with multiple overlapping blasts. The vertical displacement of the stern, recorded in German engineering notes as circa 2 meters, was, some argued, more than could be achieved by 4 tons alone in 120 to 140 feet of water. If X5 had slipped in earlier, laid both mines, and then been sunk, its role would have been concealed by the timing of Cameron's capture. For decades, the argument stayed academic. The wreck lay somewhere in a narrow Norwegian fjord, under shifting silt and cold water. Then, in 2003, a Norwegian dive team, exploring Kaafjord, located what appeared to be a British X-craft hull section, dimensions matching the class, damage consistent with gunfire. Crucially, the external mine clamps were empty. Local press in Finnmark immediately linked the find to the missing boat of 1943. British naval historians were more cautious. Position, orientation, and battle damage had to be matched against German gunnery logs from 0843. The discovery reignited calls, particularly from the Henty Creer family, for a posthumous Victoria Cross, or, at minimum, formal recognition that X5 had taken part in the attack, not merely been destroyed attempting to reach it. The Ministry of Defense, citing the original 1943 assessment and absence of definitive placement data, declined to reopen the award. "The evidence remains circumstantial," one archivist wrote. "Detonation may be attributed to 2 boats whose actions are known." Yet the contradiction remained. German eyewitnesses had spoken of considerably more explosive force than expected. British prisoners on Tirpitz had noticed that XE7's mine clamps were already empty when she was sighted sliding over the nets, proof that at least one other boat had operated in the enclosure before 0720, and the wreck found in 2003, lying in Kaafjord without its charges, matched precisely the scenario Henty Creer's supporters had argued since 1945. The boat got through, planted, and died trying to get out. What could not be disputed was this: all 6 X-craft dispatched for Operation Source were lost, 2 to enemy fire, 4 to tow failures, scuttling, or battle damage, and 9 men were killed, 6 captured. The official story named the boats that were seen. The water in Kaafjord may have preserved the story of the one that was not. When the last of the X-craft crews returned home, the war they had trained for was still raging. The men stepped off troop ships at Portsmouth and Scapa Flow into a Britain unrecognizable from the one they had left. Cities blackened by bombing, dockyards filled with new submarines bristling with radar and snorkels. Their mission had already entered legend inside the service. Within the Royal Navy's submarine branch, Operation Source was filed under Special Duty Extreme Hazard. Lieutenant Duncan Cameron, released from German captivity in May 1945, weighed barely 120 pounds. He was 28 years old, his skin pale from 2 years behind wire at Mar-le-Go. Reporters met him at the quay with cameras and flashbulbs. When asked about Kaafjord, he said only, "We did what we were trained to do." For his actions, Cameron received the Victoria Cross from King George VI at Buckingham Palace that October. Standing beside him was Lieutenant Godfrey Place, the second recipient, who later recalled, "It felt wrong that others weren't there to share it." 9 men were dead. 6 had survived to see peace. In the months that followed, the Admiralty used the X-craft design as the basis for a new generation of mini-subs designed for reconnaissance, sabotage, and beach obstacle clearance. The XE class entered service in 1944 and continued into the Pacific War. 2 years later, they were used against the Japanese cruiser Takao in Singapore Harbor, an attack planned and executed almost identically to Kaafjord. Lieutenant Ian Fraser and diver James McGuinness both received the Victoria Cross, closing a line of valor that had begun with Tirpitz. For the public, the story of the midget submarines remained secret until 1946, when wartime censorship was lifted. The first press accounts appeared in The Times and the Illustrated London News, describing a feat of submarine navigation without precedent. Cameron and Place toured naval bases, giving quiet lectures to new recruits. On one stage in Portsmouth, Cameron pointed to a photo of X6 half-submerged and said, "This is what happens when luck and duty meet halfway." The human toll surfaced slowly. Families of the missing crews, particularly those of X8, X9, and X5, pressed for details that never came. Admiralty letters arrived typed and unsigned, citing loss due to operational circumstances. Among the men who trained them, silence was both loyalty and burden. Chief Petty Officer Kenneth Briggs, a towing specialist, later told a naval historian, "We built them, trained them, and watched them vanish." You never get used to that. Cameron stayed in the Navy. commanding conventional submarines through the 1950s. He died on active duty in 1961 at age 44. Place rose through the ranks to Rear Admiral and retired in 1971, living quietly in Devon until his death in 1994. The medals of both men are displayed today in the Imperial War Museum, 2 small bronze crosses awarded for 3 hours of work beneath a Norwegian fjord. In 2003, when divers rediscovered the shattered hull of X-5, the surviving families of Operation Source gathered once more. They read the names of all 18 men who went out that September and never came home. The ceremony ended without speeches. Only the sound of water against the pier and the quiet recognition that their war, one fought in darkness, in silence, and for inches of movement, had finally come full circle. By the early 1950s, Operation Source had entered the curriculum of every Royal Navy submarine school. The attack on Tirpitz was studied not as a tale of heroism, but as a model of innovation under constraint. Instructors dissected each element: the towing procedures, battery endurance, net-cutting drills, and compressed air management. The failures were analyzed as rigorously as the success. Reports noted that of 6 X-craft launched, 4 were lost before reaching their targets, a casualty rate of over 65%. Yet within the Admiralty's classified archives, the mission was cited as proof of concept for small-scale naval sabotage, a discipline that would evolve into modern special operations. The X-craft legacy spread quietly across Allied navies. In 1952, the U.S. Navy commissioned Project 65A, a series of miniature submarines built at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard using British blueprints. The Soviets followed, developing their Triton swimmer delivery vehicles for harbor infiltration. The Cold War transformed what had begun as a desperate wartime experiment into a new category of warfare: covert, persistent, deniable. British engineers at Vickers and Bath designed successors, the Stickleback and Sleeping Beauty submersibles, drawing directly from the Kaafjord lessons. Outside military circles, the story faded. Britain in the 1950s was preoccupied with rationing, reconstruction, and empire withdrawal. Newspapers marked anniversaries of D-Day and El Alamein. The midget submarines remained a classified footnote. Only in 1958 did a modest film, Above Us the Waves, bring the operation back into view. The production consulted surviving crew members and used original Admiralty schematics to build life-sized X-craft replicas for filming at Pinewood Studios. The movie grossed modestly, but it reintroduced the phrase, the midget subs that crippled the Tirpitz, to a new generation. For the men who had taken part, the sudden attention felt strange. Lieutenant, now Commander, Donald Cameron, attended the premiere in uniform. When asked if the film captured the truth, he answered, "It was quieter than that." Others declined interviews altogether. Their war had been conducted in silence. Its retelling through movie dialogue felt almost indecent. Still, the film prompted Parliament to release the remaining classified photographs, grainy images of the fjord, the nets, the twisted propeller shafts. The public finally saw what the crews had crawled beneath. In 1963, the Submarine Museum at Gosport received the last surviving operational X-craft, X-24, which had attacked a floating dock in Bergen. Volunteers restored her hull, and veterans gathered for the dedication ceremony. Among them were divers from the original training flotilla, men now grey-haired, but still compact and upright. They stood beneath the rusting boat and compared scars to weld seams. One recalled the smell of the battery acid, another the sound of the periscope motor that failed Cameron inside Kaafjord. Every sound meant something, he said quietly. Every sound was life or death. The X-craft lineage continued into the nuclear age in subtler forms: swimmer delivery systems, limpet mines, deep submergence rescue craft. But the moral weight of the original raid remained singular. It had shown what 4 men could accomplish against 40,000 tons of steel. In an era shifting toward missiles and megatons, that lesson, of precision, not power, endured far longer than the war itself. By the late 1970s, the wreck of Tirpitz was gone. Between 1948 and 1957, Norwegian contractors had cut the remains apart, hauling 52,000 tons of armor plate and steel superstructure into barges bound for Narvik and Bergen. Nothing visible remained of the lonely Queen of the North except the rust-streaked imprint her hull had left on the rocks. Locals in Tromsø called the inlet Tirpitzvika, but the name was more memory than geography. The battleship that had once immobilized the Royal Navy now existed only in museum fragments: a gun sight in Trondheim, a rangefinder in Oslo, a single 15-inch shell displayed in London's Imperial War Museum. The scars on the fjord floor lasted longer. Divers in the 1980s still found Ametex residue embedded in the sediment, traces of the X-craft mines that had ripped open the ship's underside in 1943. Norwegian naval archives confirmed that the seabed beneath Kaafjord remained pocked by 2 distinct blast craters, each roughly 30 feet wide. In 1984, hydrographic surveys by the University of Tromsø used side-scan sonar to map the area. The report concluded, subsurface deformation consistent with multiple explosive events, probable residual effects of Operation Source. It was the first scientific documentation of the attack's geological footprint. As Cold War tensions thawed, a slow cooperation began between British and Norwegian naval historians. Files long locked under Official Secrets Act classification were declassified. Among them was Admiral C.B. Barry's original commendation, describing the X-craft mission as one of the most courageous acts of all time. Another file contained decrypted Enigma traffic, showing how German Naval Command in September 1943 had misinterpreted the explosions under Tirpitz as an air-delivered mine strike, delaying full realization of the submarine attack for nearly 48 hours. In 1993, 50 years after the raid, surviving members of the 12th Submarine Flotilla returned to Scotland. The Royal Navy held a commemoration at Loch Cairnborn, where the first X-craft had launched. The site was almost unchanged: grey hills, peat wind, and the same cold rain that had fallen the night the submarines vanished into the North Sea. Commander Place, then in his 70s, stood beside the restored X-24 and spoke briefly. "We were told it couldn't be done." That's usually where history starts. He paused, then added, "Cameron should be here." In the years that followed, Norway began to formally honor the operation. A memorial was erected near Alta in 2004, listing the names of all 18 men who took part. Local fishermen still reported finding pieces of anti-torpedo netting caught in their trawls, corroded loops of steel cable, reminders of the day the unthinkable had become possible. Today, the story of Operation Source lives mostly in training manuals and museum plaques, yet its logic, the use of ingenuity against overwhelming force, continues to shape how small nations and special units think about maritime warfare. The fjords are quiet again, but the lesson remains fixed in their depths. In 1943, 4 men in a 50-foot submarine altered the fate of a 42,000-ton warship, and with it, the balance of a war.